Good morning or good day to you, wherever you are and whenever you're watching. Thank you for being here. You are really appreciated. Just a friendly reminder, please hit the like and subscribe button so you can join me on this journey. And boy, is it a journey. I have 10 pages of recap from yesterday, and none of it is actually useful. Not a thing. I can take, 6-7 hours of testimony and condense it right down to basically. I don't know how you all feel about it. If you're watching, let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I don't think the prosecution are anywhere right now. The defense showed up yesterday. The defense really showed up yesterday. And they cross-examined Jeff Croft about all of this evidence that they collected, all of these guns. Haskell, stop. All of these guns and the ammunition and the spent shell casings and all of this stuff that they got, and whether it was tested. And it turns out it doesn't look like any of it was tested. No DNA, no fingerprints, no gunpowder residue to see whether it had been recently used, nothing. All of these shell casings that they picked up from the private gun range, doesn't look like any of those were tested against known or unknown weapons. Against the evidence from Maggie and Paul's crime scene. So what was the point in collecting it if it wasn't tested? They also admitted that they didn't go down the firing range and check the mount at the top end of the firing range for fired rounds to test. If they'd done that, they could have, in theory, found bullets that matched the crime scene, to prove that the gun that had been used had been on the property before. They didn't do that. No one thought to, let alone went and did it. So that sways things towards the defense in saying they didn't do a good enough job. They collected all of this stuff and then made assumptions and didn't go anywhere with it. Jeff Croft also had to admit that although there was this whole conversation over what Alex Murdaugh said in the back of the car in the second interview, and who does interviews in a car? What he said, whether it was I did him so bad or they did him so bad. And Jeff Croft, Husker, stop. Sorry, my dog is trying to mug me for treats right now because he knows I'm working. When they were talking about that, Jeff Croft admitted that, yes, he took a mental note of that. He found that interesting, and he heard the word I did him so bad in relation to Paul. But on cross-examination, he had to admit that although he made a mental note of it, he didn't make a physical note of it. It wasn't discussed. And although it was something that they were going to follow up on, they didn't. They didn't ask for clarification of the statement, even though to them that was an aha moment. Why not follow up? They agreed as a team that they weren't going to push back on his story. Why not? He also admitted that in a very, very early point, Alex Murdaugh was the only person of interest. SLED released a press release saying that there was no further danger to the public, and that Alex Murdaugh was a person of interest, no other people of interest. And that was on, I think, the 10th. So 2 or 3 days after the crime. So if he's your only person of interest, why aren't you pushing back? Why aren't you asking him what he meant by that statement if you honestly think he said I? Now, Kurt on Uncivil Law, that's where I'm watching it. Please go and subscribe to his channel and have a look at his work because it's brilliant. He was saying, you know, let's listen to this, and he played it over and over and over again and put up a poll, and slightly more people said they thought they heard I heard I listened to it with the volume up and my eyes closed over and over and over again. It sounds like but on cross-examination they played that they made sure that Jeff Croft was absolutely certain that was what he was testifying on, that Alex Murdaugh said and then they slowed down the recording. Now, bearing in mind when Alex Murdaugh is saying this, he's sobbing, his voice is higher pitched, and that is harder for you to hear, especially on a recording. So slowing it down brings it down in pitch, and also gives you longer for your brain to determine that word. Sounds like they. At 1/3 speed, it sounds like they. And although Jeff Croft has you know, repeatedly stood by his determination that it was they, that it was I, he also agreed that it was up to the jury to work out what they thought it said. So that plants a seed for me with the jury that if you can determine whether Jeff Croft is right or not on what Alex Murdaugh said, you know, he's fallible. He's not necessarily correct. And if he's not correct about that, and he's not correct about the crime scene and what was collected, how it was collected, and what was tested, if they didn't test stuff, is he really a trustworthy witness? That planted a seed, and that was it was clever. It was clever. The defense also determined that, you know, they found Maggie's phone because that wasn't at the crime scene. That was down the road in the opposite direction to where Alex Murdaugh had been that evening. That, you know, family members pitched in to find my iPhone, and Alex Murdaugh gave them the PIN for the phone, and, you know, it was nothing but helpful. He gave them permission, consent, anytime they wanted to go on the property to go and look. Anytime they wanted to interview him, like, he didn't object to anything. You know, if he is this criminal mastermind that you are trying to paint him as, then why would he be that helpful? There's helpful, and then there's do whatever you need because my family are no longer with me and I want to know who did this. That's always a seed of doubt, isn't it, for juries? The investigator also had to admit that, yes, family members are the first to be eliminated in an inquiry, but that they didn't really, they had other people that they wanted to speak to outside of that, but they didn't have any people of interest outside of that. So they didn't look at the threats that Paul had been getting, or the other things that are not in evidence in this trial yet, but the suspected fraud or the alleged fraud, and the amount of people that would be angry about that, and, you know, all the rest of it. And of course, SLED, going back to these press releases, SLED were releasing press releases essentially naming Alex Murdaugh. You know, and it's things like they didn't search his mum's house for 3 to 4 months after the crime to look for any evidence. So if he really was this mastermind and he dumped his clothes and everything else, they gave him 3 or 4 months to get rid of them. That's sloppy. That's really sloppy. Um, so they're not doing a good job at the moment of saying, hey, we did this wide-reaching investigation and he's the only person who could possibly have done this. The defense did a great job yesterday of just poking a few holes, and that's all they need to do. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense, and the defense just need to kind of go, too many holes, not a good enough investigation, and you've got reasonable doubt. Again, they talked about full cooperation and everything else. The fact that he wanted Maggie's parents in the loop to help them feel better about things, and he invited law enforcement to the memorial service, and all of these other things. And you think, the only thing he didn't want was the press at the memorial service, because they were there to celebrate Maggie and Paul's life, not to be under suspicion and everything else. But if that's the case, why invite the law enforcement if you're worried they're going to watch your behaviour? That doesn't add up. Ultimately, the aha moment of the day was the fact that they didn't search for used bullets on the firing range to be able to compare and eliminate and everything else. Just terrible forensics, recovery and processing, and terrible follow-up. If you think someone's just given you an accidental confession, why aren't you pushing that? Seriously. Maggie's family said that there were no problems, that, it was a loving relationship, that he was good for Maggie and Maggie was good for him. No one in the family or outside of it suspected, people who were familiar with the relationship and everything else would ever have suspected Alex Murdaugh. Sorry, bit dry. So ultimately, my takeaway from yesterday, because we had a whole world of incredibly boring evidence about phones yesterday. How the evidence was collected, who it was collected from, whose phones they looked at with search warrants, an explanation of incoming and outgoing calls on the information from Verizon, the phone company, that was really unnecessary. All you needed was for him to say, yes, I verify that this is the information that we handed over with regards to the search warrant. You didn't need him to go through that, because the next set of witnesses went through that information. So we lost so much time with people repeating the evidence. Call came in here, it went out there, text message received, and that kind of thing, and no context for those times. So this is another big issue. The prosecution are teeing up and they're not taking the swing. So a call came in at 8:04, 8:06. We're going to hear from the medical examiner that, Maggie or Paul passed away at around this time. So that call came in before, after, during. There's nothing like that. It's just this call came in. This call was unanswered. And the answered calls, or the calls that went through to voicemail, nothing has been said about voicemails being left, but they can't tell you whether that call was declined, rejected, or if it rang off into voicemail. And they're making this thing about Alex Murdaugh calling her, 5 times in 10 minutes or 3 times in 5 minutes, and then sending her a text after she doesn't answer saying, "Call me, babe." That's not unusual. If my other half is at work, he's not necessarily going to hear his phone ringing. So I try him a few times. That's not unusual, especially when they're on a big plot of land and she could be anywhere doing anything. She could be out on the UTV and can't hear her phone ringing. It doesn't prove anything. Him calling her babe doesn't prove anything. And there's no evidence that that language is unusual, or that, him phoning several times is unusual. If they had said, okay, compare that to the month, 6 months, however long beforehand, how many times were there phone calls that were missed? How many times did he, if the first call was missed, how many times would he then phone? What is the standard? There's nothing to compare it to. So the context just isn't there. They're teeing up and just not then hitting the ball. In the afternoon, the defence tried to object to Paul's phone being in evidence. That's an interesting move. If you've mentioned that there's a Snapchat that Alex Murdaugh was in that places him at the scene, and the defence is saying, no, it doesn't, you want that phone in evidence, don't you? But they objected to chain of custody. They felt you needed everyone who had custody of that phone at any point in the investigation to testify that they had the phone. And prosecution were like, no, you don't. You need the key players and people who did stuff with it. And the judge denied that motion to dismiss the phone as evidence. We only heard about Maggie's phone yesterday. We've still got Paul's and Alex's to go through. And that phone testimony was nearly 3 hours of boredom that gave us nothing. It's we see that the phone changed from portrait to landscape at this time. Great. What does that mean? Someone tell me if that's before or after she passed away. The phone registered 38 steps over 4 minutes. Okay, before or after? And then again, 59 steps between 8:53 and 8:55. Well, that's not a lot of steps to take in 2 minutes. So that's not necessarily that someone, that she's walking somewhere. Someone could have picked up the phone. It could have been jostled. And is that before or after she passed away? No one's telling us. And they're expecting the jury to keep track of all of this, all of the keywords and buzzwords and types of ammo and everything else, but not giving context. And it's not working for me. It's not. It's giving the defense a chance to just destroy the argument like they did with the ballistics. They had a chap called John Bedingfield testify. This is Alex Murdaugh's cousin, and he's the one who made the AR-style blackout rifles for Alex and his sons, Buster and Paul. He also made the replacement when Paul lost his gun. So he talked about, the parts and how he made it and the type of coating it had, which, it sounded like it was going to go somewhere and didn't. Like at the moment, the coatings, other than telling us that one gun was black and one was a tan in a ceramic coating, nothing. The only things that came out of that testimony that might be a little bit interesting is Alex Murdaugh didn't complete the paperwork for the suppressors. He did for the guns, but not for the suppressors. you need to fill out paperwork for certain types of accessories that go with weaponry. And Alex said to him, I'm going to put these in trust. So we need to set that up and then have that paperwork reflect that. And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Turns out pretty standard. People do that all of the time. And you think, oh, he's got suppressors, but no paperwork, can't be traced. Not true. Those suppressors are still in John Bedingfield's inventory at his workshop. So it doesn't mean anything. And suppressors on hunting equipment aren't unusual. You don't want to scare off the game that you're going after with loud gunshots. Guns are really loud. So it helps with ear protection and everything else. You need to be able to hear. So having a suppressor makes that quieter, less ear damage, everything else. And you are giving these weapons to younger people who are likely to just not bother with ear protection and other stuff. There are loads of reasons to have suppressors. This isn't, dynamite testimony in any way. He testified that yes, kind of in April, so 4 months after the guns were given as a Christmas present, Alex needed a replacement for Paul's lost gun. He didn't go with all the bells and whistles. It was a cheaper gun. That sounds like something parents would do. I bought you this expensive thing, you lost it, I will replace it, but I'm going to go with bottom of the range version because I don't want you losing it again. It's a lot of money. That sounds like parenting. Alex was not available to collect the replacement, so Maggie went. She collected, paid for, and filled in the paperwork for that. My other half does stuff for me all the time. So this doesn't prove anything. It's not like, nearly 5 years ago, this was planned and it was all in Maggie's name so that, hands were clean. That doesn't make any sense. So I don't know what we were meant to get out of that. We already knew that his cousin was a gunsmith and made the weaponry. So how does this help the jury right now? Excuse me, slurping. So we then heard from Britt Dove, who is a data analyst for SLED. He gave off weird vibes, I think is the best way. He's a computer forensic expert. He's a cell phone forensic expert. He talks, and again, this is incredibly boring testimony that I'm going to condense down. This was hours. So he talked about the kind of data that they can get from phones. So surface data is things like the things that you can see on the phone when you open it up. Texts, call logs, apps, that kind of thing, calendar, alarms. They also then do a full extraction, which is things like the hidden files, the databases that actually run your phones, and give things like, whether the phone's in landscape or portrait, GPS, battery levels, what apps were used and when, whether the power was on or off, whether it was put in airplane mode, location data like cell tower pings, and networks that like Wi-Fi networks that the phone has seen but not necessarily connected to. And then there's a physical extraction, which gives you programming ability on the phone, which they didn't use. He processed Alex, Maggie, and Paul's phone. And kind of they made this big deal about how you break into a phone, and they got the passcode, and for Maggie's phone, and Paul's passcode was handed over to the Secret Service to crack, and they tried numbers associated with his birthday, and ta-da, opened his phone. So we didn't get a lot out of that. Again, they talked about Faraday bags and that kind of thing, and how and when data can be accessed from outside, and that kind of thing. No evidence that happened. I've shared with you about these missed phone calls, and the times, but no context for, was it before, during, or after? Where was Alex when these calls were made? Nothing like that. So again, we're kind of in a place of, okay, where is this going? You've teed this up. Tell me where it goes from here. But they are sticking with the timeline of the investigation and not the timeline of events. And they are expecting the jury to remember all of this and be able to connect the dots themselves. And we're all watching and taking notes and we can't remember. So how a jury is going to do that? Kurt, really, it's conjecture with no information to back it up, is what he said. And it's a large property, and they probably call each other a lot. When you can pick up a phone and phone your other half when they're, 1,700, they're in 1,700 acres of land, you're going to do that rather than going out and calling their name and trying to find them on a UTV. I would. It makes sense. Used to be walkie-talkies on land that big if they carried that far. So, just it doesn't give us anything. James from court said the same thing. The ball gets teed up and they just don't take the swing. And again, he said, as far as he's aware, he's certainly not heard them in court kind of go, these calls in relation to time of death are. There's just nothing. There's nothing. The interesting thing that James said is when the data analysts started talking about the kind of data that your phone records automatically, some of the jury members were nodding and looked interested. He didn't say whether that interest kind of peaked and then drifted off like it did for the rest of us. So, at the moment, again, prosecution are just not doing their job. They're giving the defense a chance to poke holes that raise more questions than answers. So I think, if you're starting from an unbiased place of innocent until proven guilty, that needle has not moved anywhere near the guilty mark right now. One thing I will add, Kurt was saying that motive may not come into this because talking about possible motives, bringing in the financial stuff, because of course he's accused of a lot of fraud, may prejudice the other trials, and they can't do that. So we might get a story of this is how we think Mr. Murdaugh did these crimes in 16 minutes, or we think the window was bigger and this is how he did it, but we're not going to necessarily get the why they think that. And that's going to be a problem. Because if you've already got holes in your case in terms of the investigation, the evidence that you've collected, and who else you investigated with all of these threats and everything else against Paul and the family in general, then, those dots aren't connected. Because a loving father, everyone says he was a loving father that doted on his kids. His son Buster is in court every day. And he looks relaxed. So, you know, if you're trying to say that this loving father who spoiled his kids by buying them thousands of dollars worth of weaponry and UTVs and all of that stuff, did this heinous crime, you've got to give us a why. We are creatures that need a why. That's why we watch this stuff. That's why I watch this stuff, is I need the why. I need to understand what drives a human being to do this stuff. This is why, you know, it's part of my mental health thing. I need to know the bad guy got it. And I need to know that justice was served, that they got the right guy. And right now, I am not convinced that they have. And if it turns up that they tee up all of these balls and don't strike any of them with context, they've either got the right guy, but for the wrong reasons, and he's going to be found not guilty, or they've got the wrong guy and the real perpetrator or perpetrators are still out there. And all of this from what people are saying in the chat and what Kurt's saying from his experience of living in South Carolina, SLED have this exact reputation and have had this reputation for a long time. They go in gung-ho, they clap each other on the back, job well done, but don't actually follow through on stuff. So we'll see whether that bears out, whether we get any context for any of this. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, help the channel grow. But also, you know, thank you so much for being here for my recaps. Let me know if you have any thoughts. Let me know if you have any questions or anything you want me to pay attention to, and I'll speak to you soon. Thank you.